All right. We're live on the interwebs. All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the tail end of Save Jersey's live cast. Is it live cast, Alex? Live stream? It seems like they keep changing the name for what these things are. Live show? It's a live, folks. We're nearing the end of our live from Atlantic City here at Harrah's Casino. We've been here for about 36 hours. And when you're inside a casino, by design, you lose track of space and time. But we've been having a good time. We've had a lot of really interesting conversations with a lot of really cool people about 2022 in particular, where things are going. We keep hearing about this red wave, but what exactly does that mean? So we have someone here who understands the numbers and can help us unpack this. He is Brock McCleary of Signal. Now, I suspect for those of you that are not complete disgusting political nerds like me, you may have heard of Signal, but you're not sure exactly where you heard it. The reason you've heard the name Signal is because Brock is one of the leading pollsters in the country. You very frequently see his polls cited by campaigns. He's the guy you bring in when you just don't want to find a poll that says what you want it to say. You want to find out what the real lay of the land is. And the reason we wanted to talk to Brock today, besides the fact that he's a nice guy, and welcome, by the way.
Thank you.
Great
Thanks
to see you here. Oh, our pleasure. Is you recently produced a poll for the New Jersey Republican Party. It was released on the 23rd of March, and it definitely raised some eyebrows in the Garden State. I think that's a little bit of an understatement. And, there's a lot to unpack here, and I want to try to do that. But the most interesting thing right off the bat is this is a state that Joe Biden won by about 15, 16 points in 2020. Your poll shows him underwater, his job approval rating in the Garden State.
Yeah, I come bearing good news in that regard. President Biden has had a rough start to his presidency, to say the least, and the data reveals that as well. And it does so here in New Jersey, and it does across the country. Specifically here, we have about 45% of voters statewide telling us they approve of the job that the president is doing, and 53% who say they disapprove. And what becomes important, though, is looking at specific groups within the electorate to really get a sense of where do the midterms likely head. And in New Jersey, that is all about the unaffiliated voter. The unaffiliated voter determines who wins elections here, and in that regard, they are very unhappy with Joe Biden. Numbers that would, defy any real historical context, and by that I mean that 65% of unaffiliated voters in the state disapprove of Joe Biden, and so that really becomes the key metric we look at to determine, how big is the wave as you refer to it. And I don't know that I think it's building. That's what this data indicates, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity around the country, and there's going to be a lot of Republican gains to come in New Jersey this year.
65% is a pretty massive number for anywhere, especially New Jersey, a state which we know in federal elections tends to lean a bit to the left. Now, of course, in New Jersey, we've got roughly 1 million Democrat voter registration advantage, but Jack Ciattarelli only lost last November by 3 points. So I don't think you're wrong. I'm not a pollster. I'm not a numbers guy, but just looking at this stuff on its face, if Joe Biden continues and the Democrat Party hemorrhages unaffiliated voters that intensely heading into the fall elections, all of a sudden NJ3, NJ5, we don't have district-specific data here, but you have to assume that some of these lean Democrat districts are now in play, right?
Yeah, I think that the data we're seeing around the country tells us that districts that Biden won by as much as 15% need to be House districts that Republicans pay attention to and possibly invest in, and that certainly includes more than a few here in New Jersey. What the Biden disapproval really drives is it drives a preference for Republicans on what we call the generic ballot, meaning would you generally prefer to vote for a Republican or a Democrat in the upcoming midterm elections. Republicans lead statewide by 3%. And in context, that is an extremely good number. I mean, New Jersey, as you mentioned, because of Democratic registration, it's going to lean, in the mid single digits to high single digits generally for a Democrat. And so the fact that we have a Republican advantage here is really significant. But again, it comes back to that independent voter where we have a 12% advantage among an affiliated. And when you look at 2010, when Republicans won House seats by large margins, 63 of them, same dynamic was occurring. You were seeing unaffiliated or independent voters move dramatically towards Republicans. In 18, in Donald Trump's first midterm, we saw it go the other way. We saw unaffiliated breaking so hard for Democrats that we knew that we had a real problem. Last year here in New Jersey and in Virginia, which were really sort of the bellwethers of what's coming, we saw very much the same thing. In New Jersey legislative districts, the competitive ones, the purple ones, we again were seeing unaffiliateds by late summer start to break really hard for Republicans. So it was easy to sort of look at the map and say Republicans said we're going to be more aggressive here. And I think that's why we did so well at the legislative level, is because we identified that the environment was moving in our direction instead of being defensive and fearful, as Republicans sometimes worry about, because New Jersey's a hard state to win in.
Oh, yeah.
I think they got aggressive, and they really reaped the rewards of that.
When you talk about environmental factors, looking at some of the concerns of New Jersey voters, inflation, way out ahead, climate change, way far behind. So in New Jersey, where we've got Phil Murphy pushing a green energy master plan that's going to cost billions and billions of dollars, and at the national level, we have Mayor Pete, our transportation secretary, telling people to just go out and buy an electric car. It doesn't seem like that messaging is going to play that well this November.
No, not at all. The Democrats are what we call off message, is a polite way to say that.
That is very polite.
Over the last 2 months, we've seen inflation become the number one issue all over the country. We even see it in Republican primary races where, the issue set in Republican primaries is sometimes more cultural. Economics is driving that. Inflation has become the dominant issue everywhere I see, and I think that is a real big problem for the Democrats, in that a midterm election with the Democrats controlling the White House, controlling Congress, it's going to be good for us. But when people are hurting, and they're hurting in ways that are very tangible, meaning at the grocery store, at the gas station, pain that can be felt in an immediate in proximity, really is the thing that turns good cycles into incredibly good cycles. And I think inflation is driving a lot of that sentiment right now.
And you mentioned Virginia, there's an issue that was big last year, which in your poll continues to figure in very prominently on voters' minds, which is this notion of what's happening in our public schools and whether or not Democrats have gone too far. The question you asked is, has government gone too far on public education? 57% agreed with that statement. It's massive.
Education is historically an issue that voters tend to trust Democrats more than Republicans. Like healthcare has been, taxes, economics tend to be our issue. We saw in Virginia things that started to change in that regard, and we find whether it's from curriculum to mandates in the schools and how kids live their lives in the schools, that has really drawn a division between suburban moms and dads and the Democratic Party. And it has an opportunity to really put some districts in play, because I think there's no retreat from the Democratic position on this. I think they're sort of born into this idea that parents don't have any right to know what's being taught in their schools, and that they can do by fiat whatever they'd like that has affected kids for the last 2 years. And I think there's a reckoning coming in that regard too.
Yeah, it seems like voters are starting to get the joke. 63% in your poll said it's time to end the remaining COVID mandates. There's not really much of anything that if you're a Democrat, you can look at this poll and find any solace. We've been talking a lot about polls at the summit this weekend. In your industry, I think you would probably agree with this, has a branding problem. The Republican Party's had a branding problem in recent years. The polling industry has a branding problem. The public polls got it miserably wrong in New Jersey in in 2021 to the point. This is my personal belief, but I think a lot of people here agree with me. It was almost voter suppression. The polls were so far off that it discouraged investment in Jack Ciattarelli's campaign in Republican races in New Jersey. Certainly, I'm sure there's some people in New Jersey that said, well, here we go again, the Democrat's going to win again. Why should I bother to rush home from work or skip that other event I wanted to go and vote when it's not going to matter anyway? It's hard to look at it any other way. Why do you think pollsters continue to miss some of these big calls? And do you think that maybe it's time to pivot away from horse race polling and instead focus on some of the issue polling that you presented in this particular report?
Yeah, a couple things there. Well, I mean, I think the reason that we have problems in polling is that some of what happens in the industry is fairly antiquated. But I want to, and I'll come back to that, I want to touch on your point about the polls and the way that they become weaponized in campaigns by the media. Donald Trump is where we saw this happen in 2016, where polls continually tried to dampen enthusiasm, they dry up money. I think Ciattarelli in New Jersey experienced the same thing. We saw that the race was going to be close. Within, I think we had it 2 or 3 points going into the weekend before, but that was 3 months preceded that of media polls said, that race is over there.
Writing
Murphy's
it
gonna
off.
get reelected. It has a terrible impact, and it is what is another factor that is hurting poll accuracy is that Republicans no longer trust taking polls, because they see that it was weaponized against Donald Trump, a person they still like considerably, and they see it happen in states all over the country. So Republicans are apprehensive to take a survey. When we conduct a survey, we say in the beginning, we disclaim that this is not for a media organization, because that will get Republicans to participate at a higher level in a more honest fashion.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I'm just trying to think of what I would do if CNN calls me and they wanted to poll me. Knowing what I know about this, you probably should answer the poll, because otherwise it's just going to help further skew the results, but you certainly don't want to do them any favors. So that's very interesting. If you have any general advice for Republicans coming out of this poll in New Jersey as they head into 2022, what would it be?
Stay focused on the things that voters care about. And I think that's where Democrats are going to miss the boat. The things they care about are priorities that aren't important right now when people are hurting, people are suffering coming through COVID and the devastation of the economy and inflation. And if you start talking about stuff that isn't foremost in voters' mind about personal finances and really, are we going to get back on our feet as a country at some point here? If Republicans continue to talk about those things, we will win. I think Democrats' biggest problem is they're going to want to have fights about defunding the police and things that just don't matter. And you get away with that when the country's having a grand time. You can have misplaced priority, but when people are hurting, you better be talking about the thing that people identify as the source of pain. If Republicans can connect inflation to bad policy in Washington and Trenton, boy, then you're hitting a homer.
Brock McCleary of Signal Polling, thanks so much for coming on here and helping us break down something that, as I said at the beginning, has a lot of people in New Jersey talking this week. And I think at least a few Democrats, at least the smart ones, may be sweating some bullets. So couldn't happen to a nicer group of people, folks.
Thanks so much for having me.
Definitely don't be a stranger. We're going to have you back to help us break things down as we head into November.
Anytime, Matt. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Folks, we think we have some more interviews in us today, but we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have more from the Republican Leadership Summit in Atlantic City. So this is your chance to go get a little more caffeine, stretch those legs, and then head on back.